On the outer bend of Hollow Creek, where the road narrowed into ruts and the woods leaned in close enough to block the sun, the Patterson house sat in a clearing that seemed untouched by wind or birdsong. The two-story structure was painted a dull white, though the wood beneath showed through in thin splintered veins. Curtains remained drawn in every season, not a thread of lace or hint of movement breaking the blank faces of the windows. Even the smoke from the chimney rose in thin, reluctant strands, curling back toward the ground as if repelled by the air itself. Travelers passing through often slowed their wagons when they reached that part of the road, glancing at the house without meaning to, the same way one might glance toward a gravestone that bore no name. The Pattersons were not poor, nor were they known for trouble. Yet there was an unspoken rule in the town of Millwater. You didn't call on them without need. Calvin Patterson, tall and gaunt from his years in the Union Army, had the distant manner of a man who had seen too much and chosen to keep it locked away. His left hand shook faintly, a tremor that made even the act of lighting his pipe an ordeal. Eleanor Patterson was the town's midwife, competent and composed, though her eyes had a weight in them that unsettled those she tended to. When she walked the dirt road into town, people greeted her politely but never lingered. She rarely smiled, and when she did, it was small, as if given reluctantly. The twins were born in the summer of 1875 on a night thick with heat and the smell of honeysuckle. Clara first, then Isabel, both pale and small but breathing without struggle. There was nothing in their first moments that foretold what they would become, except perhaps the fact that they did not open their eyes. Not at the first cry, nor in the following days. Eleanor told neighbors that the girls were slow to adjust to light, that she kept them in shaded rooms to avoid strain. Most accepted it without question, assuming time would correct what nature had delayed. But weeks became months, and still their lids remained closed. The girls fed well, grew steadily, and began to move in their cribs with uncanny coordination, turning their heads at the same moment, curling their fingers in mirrored motions. There was never the groping uncertainty of the blind, nor the hesitant reach of the newborn. Their movements were certain, as if they knew exactly where each object was without the need to see it. Eleanor took this as a sign of their refinement, an inheritance of some inner discipline she alone understood. Calvin said nothing about it, though he watched them with the same wary glance a man might give a caged animal. By the time they were 3, Clara and Isabel spoke in soft, indistinct murmurs, but only to each other. No one could make out the words, and Eleanor discouraged anyone from trying. The girls' skin was cool even in the summer heat, and their faces bore a smoothness that seemed untouched by emotion. When they were taken outside, they walked between their parents with their heads tilted downward, never stumbling, never reaching for a hand or guide. More than one neighbor noticed that when they passed the schoolyard, every child stopped playing as if the air had changed. Inside the Patterson house, silence was kept like a law. The floorboards never creaked. The clock in the parlor had been stopped for years, the pendulum removed. Even the kitchen, which should have been filled with the noise of work, was quiet save for the faint scrape of a knife on wood or the soft hiss of a boiling pot. Eleanor had a way of moving about without sound, her skirts brushing the floor like water slipping past stone. Calvin's boots rarely touched the floorboards with full weight, as if he had learned to step carefully to avoid waking something. Visitors, few as they were, spoke afterward of a strange heaviness in the air, as if they had stepped into a place buried far underground. The curtains were thick, the lamps shaded low, and the air smelled faintly of something sweet but stale, like dried flowers kept too long in a jar. It was not unclean, but it was unnatural in its stillness. Even the Patterson's dog, an old hound that rarely left the porch, moved quietly inside, tail low, eyes darting toward the twins before looking away again. As the years passed, the twins became less a topic of curiosity and more a subject of whispered caution. Mothers told their children not to stare if they saw the Patterson girls in town. Men who met Calvin's eye in the tavern looked away quickly, unwilling to invite conversation that might drift toward the subject of the house on Hollow Creek. The Pattersons did not seek friendship, and the town did not offer it. And yet, for all the unease they inspired, there was no act, no proof that gave anyone the right to intervene. From the outside, the family was whole. A husband who worked his land, a wife who served the community in her trade, and 2 daughters who were, by all accounts, healthy. It was only in the quietest moments when a visitor caught the faint sound of a whisper through the wall, or when a child on the road swore they felt eyes on them from behind a closed curtain, that the truth pressed close enough to be felt. Something inside that house was awake, and it had been waiting for years. By the time Clara and Isabel were 5, the town had stopped asking when they might open their eyes. Whatever curiosity had lingered in those early years was replaced by an unspoken agreement not to dwell on the matter. In Millwater, some things were left alone for fear that attention itself might invite harm. The Pattersons did nothing to discourage this. Their visits to town were rare and deliberate, Eleanor arriving with her basket of remedies, Calvin coming for nails, grain, or tobacco. Each transaction handled quickly, each return to Hollow Creek made without pause. The twins never came along. Inside the Patterson home, their days followed a schedule that never varied. Eleanor's journals, which would only be found decades later, described their routine in neat, unwavering script. Rising at the same hour, meals measured precisely by weight, walking in the enclosed yard for exactly 30 minutes regardless of season. Even their sleep was regulated, not simply in hours but in position, with Eleanor noting which side they lay on, and how many minutes it took for their breathing to deepen. Any deviation was recorded in red ink, a small symbol drawn in the margin. Though their eyelids remained sealed, the girls grew in other ways, taller, stronger, and disturbingly graceful. They moved in tandem without apparent communication, one stepping forward just as the other did, turning at the same instant, as though obeying an unseen conductor. When they reached for an object, their hands found it without hesitation. Once, when a teacup fell from Eleanor's hand in the kitchen, both girls turned their heads toward the sound at the exact same moment, even though they were 2 rooms away. Eleanor's journal noted the event with satisfaction, describing it as proof of their unbroken attunement. By 7, they spoke more often, but never to anyone but each other. Their speech was fast and low, a thread of sound that seemed to skip over the ears of anyone listening. Calvin once told a passing neighbor that the girls kept to their own tongue, but would not elaborate. Those who heard it described the cadence as wrong, not in words, but in rhythm, like a song played backward or a prayer spoken in reverse. Eleanor's fascination with silence grew alongside the twins. She stopped keeping a rooster, explaining that its crow disrupted the household's balance. The hound was put down quietly one summer without reason given. She replaced metal cooking utensils with wooden ones, packed the shutters with strips of wool to muffle the wind, and refused to allow clocks or bells in the house. In her journals, she referred to this process as conditioning the space, a phrase she underlined again and again. It was not enough for the twins to live in silence. The silence had to be absolute. What Calvin thought of all this, no one knew. He kept his distance from most folk and when pressed claimed Eleanor had her ways. And he didn't interfere. Yet on more than one occasion a farmhand passing the property claimed to have seen Calvin in the yard at night, smoking with a hunched back, staring toward the annex that had begun to take shape at the rear of the house. At first it was little more than a framework of rough beams, but even in its unfinished state it had no windows. The twins rarely left the yard. When they did, it was only under Eleanor's close watch, both girls walking in perfect unison, hands clasped in front of them, heads slightly bowed. They never stumbled, never seemed uncertain of where their feet would land, even when walking over the uneven ruts of the back lane. On one such walk, a boy from the schoolyard, bold with the recklessness of youth, darted in front of them and clapped his hands sharply. Neither girl flinched. Eleanor gripped each by the shoulder and led them away without a word. But the boy swore later that just before they turned the corner, Clara's lips moved in a way that made him feel sick to his stomach, though he could not hear what she said. Season after season passed without change. The Pattersons' isolation deepened. In town, Eleanor's visits became even briefer, her exchanges limited to essentials. Calvin spoke less, his frame thinning, the tremor in his hand worsening. Yet the twins thrived physically. Their hair kept long and brushed to a sheen, their pale skin without blemish, their nails filed smooth. It was as if they were being preserved, maintained like delicate instruments rather than raised as children. By 1880, the first rumors began, not shouted in taverns but murmured over fences and in the back pews of the church. Some said the girls were blind, others that they were cursed. A few went further, claiming they were not truly children at all, but changelings left in the place of the real Patterson daughters. No one dared say this to Eleanor, but more than one family quietly stopped calling for her midwife services, citing other reasons. Still, no proof of wrong could be found. There were no signs of abuse, no reason to involve the law. The Pattersons lived within their rights, and the twins, as strange as they were, appeared healthy and unharmed. Yet anyone who stepped inside that house came away with the same quiet conviction. Something unnatural was being cultivated there. Not in violence or chaos, but in order so rigid, so deliberate, that it pressed the air flat and left the mind unsettled. What the townsfolk could not see, what Eleanor noted in her journal night after night, was that the twins' eyes had begun to move beneath their lids. Tiny rapid tremors that came only when they were still, as if they were watching something in the dark that no one else could see. Eleanor called these moments the drift, recording their length and frequency with growing anticipation. She believed the time was nearing when they would be ready. though for what she did not yet write. The summer of 1881 was dry, the kind that baked the soil into cracks and left the creek sluggish and low. Joseph Murdoch, a wiry farmhand of 23, was known to ride the back lanes with his wagon loaded in the early mornings, delivering coal and kindling to the outlying homesteads. He was not a man anyone would call reckless, but he was known for lingering to talk when a job was done, always hopeful for a hot meal or a cool drink. On a day in late August, his route brought him to Hollow Creek and the Patterson home. The delivery was routine: 2 sacks of coal for the kitchen stove and 1 for the annex stove Calvin had begun fitting the year before. By sundown, his wagon was found in the back lane near the property. The horse was tied loosely to the fence, shifting uneasily, its coat damp with sweat despite the cooling air. The cart was empty, the sacks gone. Joseph himself was nowhere to be found. Calvin told the constable that Joseph had left before dusk, heading toward Millwater with the road clear before him. He spoke plainly, as if the matter were simple and unremarkable. But the constable noticed something as he stood near the back of the house. The ground around the root cellar was damp, though there had been no rain for days. The mud bore streaks of something darker than water, thickened in patches where the flies had already begun to gather. Calvin explained that he had been storing butchering scraps for the hound, but the animal had been gone for months. The constable said nothing more at the time, filing the detail away in the quiet recesses where lawmen keep their unease. In the weeks that followed, there was no trace of Joseph. Search parties fanned out into the fields and creek beds, but the land around Hollow Creek had a way of swallowing things. The thickets were dense, the soil riddled with sinkholes that could open and close without warning. Without evidence of foul play, the matter began to fade from conversation, replaced by the day's harvest and the drought's toll on the corn. Yet some noticed changes at the Patterson home. At night, faint thuds and the rasp of a saw carried across the still air, long past the hour most farmhouses went dark. A thin smell drifted from the back of the property, a mix of fresh-cut timber and something metallic that clung to the tongue. By the first frost, Calvin began building a new structure behind the house. It rose from the earth like a black box, narrow and tall, with no sign of windows or chimney. The boards were thick, fitted so tightly that no seam showed between them. He worked without hired hands, refusing offers of help with a quiet shake of his head. Always at night, by the glow of a single oil lamp, he moved with a patience that seemed almost ritualistic. Neighbors passing on the road saw him pause often, standing still with his head bowed as if listening for something within the boards themselves. Eleanor's part in the construction was harder to see, but her presence was there in the small details. A stack of uncut wool batting arrived in the wagon of a trader from 2 towns over, its delivery unannounced. A barrel of coarse salt was hauled from the creek's edge to the annex door. Her journals from that autumn, later recovered, noted preparatory insulation and stability for conditioning, though no further explanation was given. The twins were never seen near the structure, but the faint synchronized rhythm of their footsteps could sometimes be heard in the dirt yard after dark, tracing circles in the frost. As the Azanidon annex walls rose, so too did the unease in Millwater. Calvin's trips into town became less frequent. Eleanor came alone for supplies, her lists written in tight, angular script. When asked casually about Joseph Murdoch, she gave a small, dismissive shrug, saying only that some men wander off when they lose their way. She spoke without malice, but with an odd finality, as if the matter were not tragic but inevitable. By December, the annex stood complete. Its single door was fitted with an iron bolt and a key that never left Calvin's possession. No windows broke its smooth, tar-dark sides. Inside, the air was colder than the winter outside, the kind of cold that felt deliberate, maintained. Whatever was within could not be seen from the yard, but neighbors swore they heard faint noises, not cries, not words, but something like a breath held too long and released in slow, controlled measures. One farmhand, delivering grain, claimed he heard a muffled knock from inside the annex, followed by silence so sudden it felt like the air had been drained from the night. The constable returned once more, walking the perimeter without entering. He noted the same dark stains near the root cellar, though the ground was now frozen hard. Calvin met his gaze only briefly before returning to his work, planing the edge of a thick board as if nothing stood behind the door but tools and wood shavings. Without cause for a search, the law could do nothing, and the constable left with the uneasy knowledge that whatever secrets lay inside would remain there, for now. The disappearance of Joseph Murdoch faded from the town's active memory by spring, but something had shifted in the Patterson home. The curtain seemed drawn tighter, the yard kept even more still. The twins, when glimpsed, walked with the same measured pace as before, their heads tilted slightly toward the annex as if aware of something no one else could sense. And at night, if one stood on the road long enough, the sound of Calvin's hammer would rise from the darkness, steady and unhurried, as though the work he had begun was not merely carpentry, but the shaping of a place where silence itself could be kept alive. The annex stood for years as a sealed riddle, its black walls aging slower than the house itself, until a single loose word brought a piece of its truth to light. It came from a visiting cousin of Calvin's, a man who claimed to have stepped inside one afternoon while Eleanor was away. He said the air in that chamber was strange from the moment the door shut, as though all outside noise had been swallowed. The walls were lined thickly with layers of sheep's wool stitched into tight panels, their yellowed edges damp in places from the salt that coated the floor. Every surface was meant to drink in sound, to keep it from escaping. But the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, like standing deep under water, where every breath feels too loud and every movement too sharp. In the center of the room sat a chair, not the kind meant for rest but for restraint. Its frame was carved from heavy oak, the arms and legs fitted with leather straps cracked from use. The headrest was padded, but a hinged iron clamp arched over it, the sort that could lock the skull in place. The floor beneath the chair was worn smooth in a perfect oval, as though feet had pressed there countless times, always in the same position. Along the beams above, iron hooks were driven deep, their points dulled with age but stained dark in a way the cousin refused to describe in detail. On one wall, near where the wool lining was thickest, a tin funnel jutted out. It was no bigger than a man's hand, its rim dented, its narrow end disappearing into the wall where it met a brass tube. The cousin traced it upward with his eyes and saw it vanish into the ceiling, perhaps leading into the house above. When he asked Calvin its purpose, the older man replied without pause that it was for feeding the quiet, before turning his back and bolting the door. It was Eleanor who gave the chamber its name, the sound room. To her it was not a place of punishment, but of refinement. She spoke of corrective stillness as though it were a form of medicine, a cure for imperfections in the soul. The twins began spending hours inside, their time measured not by clocks but by the slow melting of a block of ice placed in a shallow pan beneath the chair. Eleanor recorded each session in her journals, noting the steadiness of their breathing, the lack of visible tension, and most of all their ability to remain entirely silent. She believed that to achieve perfect quiet, the mind must first be stripped of its instinct to respond, to sound, to discomfort, to pain. When the twins emerged from the sound room, their hands often trembled faintly, as if they had been gripping something unseen. But their faces betrayed nothing, no strain, no exhaustion, no fear. They walked the yard afterward as they always did, heads slightly lowered, steps in unison. Sometimes their hair carried the faint smell of salt, other times the acrid tang of the brass tube's inner lining. Eleanor praised their progress in words no one else heard, her approval given like a benediction to a congregation of two. On rare occasions, the muffled shape of another figure could be glimpsed in the doorway before it closed. Not Calvin, not Eleanor, but someone from outside. A neighbor's errand boy who had not been seen in weeks, or a trader passing through whose route never brought him back. These sightings were spoken of only in half-formed sentences, quickly abandoned as if the thought itself might draw attention from the wrong place. Those who believed what they'd seen convinced themselves they were mistaken, because believing otherwise meant accepting the possibility that the sound room's purpose was not just for the twins. Over time, the annex became a place the townsfolk avoided even from the road. Travelers quickened their pace when they passed the bend where its roofline appeared between the trees. It was said that if you lingered there too long on a still night, you might hear a sound that didn't belong. Not a cry, not a voice, but the faintest scrape of leather tightening against wood or the slow, deliberate turning of a hinge. Whatever truth the sound room held, it remained locked inside, feeding on the hours given to it, shaping the silence into something Eleanor alone could measure. And the twins, obedient and unblinking, were becoming its most perfect creations. By 1883, Eleanor's ambitions for the twins had moved beyond discipline into what she called sensory calibration. The term appeared again and again in her journals, written in the same steady, careful hand as her midwife notes, as though these entries were part of the same legitimate science. But these were no medical records. They were case studies, numbered, dated, and annotated with a cold precision that revealed the mind of someone who believed she was not committing harm, but performing a higher service. Each subject, whether family, stranger, or those who simply wandered too close, was a trial in her search for what she called the quiet. The process began with breath. Eleanor wrote that life's noise began in the lungs, in the irregular and selfish rhythm of human respiration. To correct this, she submerged her subjects in near-freezing water, forcing their bodies to fight the instinct to gasp. On a shelf in the sound room, a brass metronome ticked steadily, its pace slower than a resting heartbeat. The subject would be held under until their body began to match that rhythm, their breath shrinking to fit the pattern she demanded. Clara and Isabel endured this without panic, their small bodies already accustomed to her timings. Others did not fare as well. Some emerged coughing violently, their lips turning blue. A few never emerged at all. In those cases, Eleanor simply wrote non-compliant beside the date and moved on. Once breathing was subdued, she worked on thought. In her journals, she described noise as not just a sound, but an intrusion of the mind. Stray impulses, fears, and desires that disrupted purity. To dull this inner clamor, she fed her subjects small, regular doses of powdered lead mixed into milk. The taste was masked with honey, but the effect was unsoftened. Over days, movement slowed, speech slurred, and eyes lost their restless flicker. She considered this proof that the quiet had begun to take hold, noting with satisfaction how subjects seemed less burdened by the need to respond to the world. For Clara and Isabel, these treatments were not punishments, but lessons. Eleanor praised their stillness, their obedience, recording with pride how they could endure hours without twitching a muscle, their breathing steady, their faces void of strain. She called them living vessels of silence, convinced they were becoming something beyond human. Carriers of a purity no other person she had tested could sustain. The twins, in turn, offered no sign of resistance. Whether through conditioning, fear, or some deeper pact only they understood. They accepted each session without protest, emerging pale and dripping from the water or swallowing the lead-laced milk with the same calm they showed while walking the yard. As Eleanor's confidence grew, her experiments reached beyond the twins. Visitors who came to the house and stayed too long might find themselves drawn toward the annex under one pretext or another, to fetch something for Eleanor, to help Calvin with a repair. Once inside the sound room, the door would bolt behind them and the tests would begin. Some were made to stand blindfolded for hours while Eleanor paced slowly around them, tapping the metronome in her palm, her steps falling in exact time. Others were suspended from the hooks in the beams by their wrists, their toes barely brushing the salted floor, until the salt burned raw into their skin. She believed the pain sharpened the mind's retreat into silence, a necessary step toward purification. The journals revealed no remorse, only adjustments. If a method failed to produce the stillness she desired, it was refined or replaced. There were pages filled with temperature readings, time intervals, and diagrams of the human ear and lung. Beside one such drawing she had written, "The ear is the mouth of the mind. Starve it, and the mind will feed on nothing." Her fixation was complete. The world outside the Patterson home existed only as a reservoir of unshaped noise, from which she could draw subjects to refine her craft. By the year's end, Clara and Isabel's days were divided between ordinary tasks and these sessions, their lives an unbroken pattern of preparation. Their hands remained cold, their expressions unchanged, but there was something deeper now in the way they moved, as if their bodies carried an echo of the sound room even in open air. And when they stood side by side, heads tilted slightly in that familiar mirrored way, it was impossible to tell whether their silence was born of submission or of something they had truly become. The winter of 1885 came early, a long white shroud that settled over Millwater and held fast. Snow buried the fields, froze the creek, and muted every sound but the crunch of boots on ice. It was during this deep cold that 3 children disappeared from farms scattered across the outer lanes. The first was Thomas Ebbett, a boy of 10 sent out to gather kindling before dusk. His father found the basket dropped in the snow, the small footprints leading away from the woodpile toward the tree line, and then vanishing where the drifts grew high. The second was Mary Collis, a quiet girl who had been walking home from her aunt's farm along the back road. Her bonnet was found tangled in a hawthorn bush near Hollow Creek. The third, the youngest, was Caleb Drummond, barely 6 years old, last seen chasing a stray chicken that had wandered beyond the fence. His mother found only the bird's tracks returning. The town searched as it always did, forming lines to comb the frozen ground, calling names into the muffled air. Yet each search ended in the same uneasy silence. The only trail that offered direction was Thomas Ebbett's, and it led toward the Patterson property before disappearing entirely near the frozen curve of the creek. The constable visited the Pattersons, asking politely but firmly if they had seen the children. Calvin stood in the doorway, Eleanor behind him, both dressed in black despite the visit being unplanned. They claimed ignorance, voices calm, their faces free of concern. Clara and Isabel were visible in the parlor beyond, standing side by side with their heads tilted toward the floor, their eyelids lowered as if in sleep. Weeks passed with no thaw, and the fear in Millwater deepened. Doors that had once been left unlatched were now barred at night. Children were kept indoors, chores shifted to older hands. Even the church pews thinned on Sundays, the wind cutting sharp across the lanes and the suspicion that evil walked among them, making the air colder still. Yet the Pattersons never missed a service. They arrived each week on foot, moving in a slow, measured line down the aisle. Calvin first, then the twins between, Eleanor last. All dressed in immaculate black wool without a single speck of snow melting on their shoulders. They sat without movement for the entire sermon, eyes lowered, hands folded neatly in their laps. Not once did they turn to meet the gaze of those who watched them. When the thaw finally came in late March, the snow melted in heavy sheets from the annex roof, dripping into the hardened earth below. A boy from the neighboring farm, wandering too close while chasing a stray calf, noticed something odd behind the structure. The ground there had sunk in a shallow, uneven dip, the soil softer than anywhere else in the yard. It looked as though it had been disturbed, then packed down again, but without the care one might take with planting. He told his father, who told the constable, who walked the yard but found nothing that would hold in a court. The annex door was locked, and without a warrant there was no entry. Still, the constable marked the spot in his memory, as well as the faint metallic tang in the air when he stood near it. The disappearances remained unsolved. Some said the children had wandered onto thin ice and been swept away when it broke. Others believed a drifter had taken them, moving on before the snows began. But in quiet kitchens and lamplit barns, the whispers circled back to Hollow Creek, to the annex with no windows and the family who moved like shadows between church and home. And though no one could prove it, those who had watched the Pattersons walk the snowy road that winter swore they had seen the faintest curve of a smile on Eleanor's face. her gloved hand brushing the shoulder of one twin as if to steady her, or perhaps to guide her towards something only they knew waited beneath the earth. By their 12th year, Clara and Isabel Patterson had become a name spoken only in whispers, the kind of story people glanced over their shoulders to tell. They moved in perfect unison, heads slightly bowed, hands folded, their pale lids smooth and unblinking as wax. No dust, wind, or grit ever disturbed them. No blink, no twitch betrayed even the suggestion of sight. Some swore that once or twice the lids had parted a sliver, not to reveal eyes but a clean expanse of pale, ridged skin, as though whatever once belonged there had been removed and the flesh drawn shut. Others claimed the girls did not need eyes at all, that they navigated the world by some other means, sensing the location of every nail in the floor, every hinge in the wall, every living thing in a room by the subtle shifts of air and heat. At night they walked the length of the Patterson home in total darkness, clearing tables, aligning chairs, folding linens in exact symmetry, never fumbling, never colliding with a thing. Eleanor's recovered journals offered the only glimpse into how this had been made. Her entries did not speak of accident or defect, but of deliberate preparation. A process begun before the girls could remember, when they were small enough to be lifted in one arm and held still with the other. She wrote that light was a kind of noise, that the eyes were doors through which chaos entered, and that to keep a mind pure it must never be taught to chase the shifting clutter of the visible world. She recorded times, temperatures, and measurements with the same devotion a priest might keep for liturgy. Salve applied in the quiet hours before dawn, linen pressed gently against lashes until they clung, the faintest stitches taken with a hand steady from practice, threads waxed to keep them from cutting. The work was done under layered curtains and shaded lamps, the air cool enough to slow a child's breath. Dressings were changed by the metronome's tick, each adjustment exact, each step logged in the neat, unwavering script of a woman who believed she was building something worthy. She described no moment of doubt, only progress. By their 5th year, the twins no longer turned toward windows. By 8, they could stand for hours without flinching at sudden noise. By 10, they moved through the annex with sacks in their arms, counting steps to match the rhythm Eleanor had drilled into their lungs. She trained them to know a visitor's number by the warmth along a wall, to find a dropped pin by the change in a room's breathing, to halt just short of an obstacle they could not possibly see. Neighbors watching from the road could not decide if this was the product of cruelty or some unnatural gift. The truth was colder. Eleanor did not see them as daughters, but as vessels for the quiet, instruments tuned to hold silence as a bell holds tone. The girls' lives were measured, not lived. They woke to milk warmed to the same degree each day, walked the yard in calculated patterns, slept in positions recorded and repeated. Any deviation was corrected. When strangers visited, the twins stood still, heads bent, but their lids turned minutely toward the source of breath or the creak of leather, a fraction too precise to be instinct. Some townsfolk convinced themselves the girls' faces were peaceful, that perhaps this life spared them from the harshness of the world. Others looked away quickly, unsettled by the thought that peace and absence could look the same. Calvin's part in it all was harder to read. His name appeared in Eleanor's pages only beside tasks, boards cut, wool packed, hooks driven into beams, salt weighed. If he objected, it had been swallowed by the same silence he guarded. And so the legend grew, each retelling colder than the last, of two children whose eyes had never opened to the light, who could walk through the blackest night without a stumble, whose mother called them her success. And perhaps the worst truth was not that the lids had been sealed by design, but that the work had been done so cleanly, so completely, that the town could look upon their faces and almost believe they had been born that way. And in a place that feared trouble more than it feared evil, that was enough to leave it undisturbed. By the autumn of 1887, the earth behind the Patterson house had been turned and tamped so many times that the grass never grew back in patches, leaving pale scars in the yard. Most in Millwater thought little of it. Farmers often shifted soil for compost heaps or drainage. But those who paid attention noticed the way Eleanor always worked there at night, her skirts pinned up, her boots caked with damp clay. It was during this season that a traveling peddler named James Garvey vanished on his route between Millwater and Brookford. He had stopped at the Patterson property to sell kerosene and lamp glass, his wagon seen parked near the back lane just before dusk. The next morning the wagon was found empty, its horses tied loose, reins dragging in the dirt. The lamps and kerosene were gone. Garvey was never seen again. The following week, a faint, acrid smell began drifting from the Pattersons' barn. Neighbors said it was the sharp scent of lime, the kind used to keep rot from spreading. But it was mixed with something thicker like boiled fat or scorched hide. Eleanor never explained it, and no one asked. It was Calvin who carried the heavy wooden plank from the barn each evening, placing it over a long trough set low in the packed dirt floor. The trough itself was a crude rectangle, lined with rough boards blackened from years of damp, its bottom layered in a white crust. In her journals, Eleanor referred to it plainly as the bath, but her description revealed its true purpose. It was not for washing, it was for erasing. The bath was filled not with water, but with lye, coarse and hungry, strong enough to strip flesh from bone in hours. Eleanor had perfected the mixture, a ratio that dissolved quickly but left no telltale foam, its heat masked by the chill of the barn. Victims, once they had failed her tests in the sound room, were lowered into it like unwanted linens into a washtub. She recorded the process with clinical detachment, noting how long each subject took to disappear entirely, how the solution darkened in hue depending on the condition of the body. Once the work was done, the liquid was drained into the frozen creek under the cover of darkness, seeping away before daylight could betray it. The bones, what few resisted the bath, were crushed under Calvin's boot heel and scattered in the shallow pits behind the annex, mixed with salt to keep the soil from yielding them back. To Eleanor, this was not cruelty but housekeeping. The quiet, as she saw it, could not be contaminated by the remains of those unworthy to embody it. Every failed subject was a blemish, and blemishes had to be erased so that the house, the annex, and the twins remained pure. She never called them deaths, only removals. In her records, Garvey became Subject 31, expired at 2:14, erased by dawn. The same column held the name of a farmhand no one in town had noticed was missing, a woman passing through with a sick infant who never reached the next county, and a boy whose mother assumed he had run away to work on the railway. The twins were made to watch the preparation but never the disposal. Eleanor believed they needed to understand the cost of failure without being burdened by the mess of it. On certain nights when the barn was shuttered and the lamps dimmed, they would stand in the doorway as Eleanor mixed the lye, the sharp white dust settling in her hair. She would speak softly to them about the importance of cleanliness, of keeping the quiet free from intrusion. The girls would nod, their faces serene, their pale lids lowered in obedience, their hands folded in front of them like children before a prayer. By late winter, the trough had been emptied and refilled so many times that its boards began to swell and warp from the corrosive heat. Calvin replaced them in silence, planing new planks until they fit snug against the frame. He never asked Eleanor to stop. Perhaps he had accepted her view, or perhaps his will had been stripped away as slowly as the flesh from the bodies that passed through the bath. When the snow melted that spring, the creek ran clouded for days, carrying with it whatever could not dissolve into the soil. The constable noticed his eyes narrowing as he watched the water curl white against the banks, but he found no proof. Without bodies there could be no crime, and without crime there could be no warrant for the annex. And so the Pattersons went on as they always had, attending church in black, the twins between them, their heads bowed as if in sleep. The faint scent of lye clinging to their wool like a memory no wash could remove. In Millwater, the rumors shifted from uneasy speculation to resigned acceptance. People no longer asked what happened to those who vanished near Hollow Creek. They told their children to stay away from the bend in the road and prayed their warnings would be enough. But the ground behind the annex kept sinking season after season, and those who walked the lane at night sometimes heard a low, slow bubbling from the barn, the sound of something being taken apart until nothing recognizable remained. And in the morning the yard would be smooth again, the plank replaced, and Eleanor Patterson would be at her kitchen table with her pen, writing down the night's results as neatly as if she were balancing her household accounts. The storm came hard in the autumn of 1888, rolling in from the east with a wind that pulled shingles from roofs and drove sheets of rain into the fields. The roads became rivers of mud, and travelers who had misjudged the weather sought shelter wherever it could be found. That night, 4 strangers made their way to the Patterson home. 2 men from the railway line, a woman selling fabrics, and a boy of perhaps 16 whose wagon had lost a wheel in the muck. They arrived after dark, soaked and shivering, their knocks barely audible over the wind. Eleanor opened the door without hesitation, her black dress pristine, her hair pinned in a tight coil that had not loosened in the storm. She welcomed them inside, her voice calm, her movements measured, as though their arrival had been expected. The house was warm in a way that felt unnatural for such a night. The lamps were shaded low, the curtains drawn, and the air carried the faint scent of milk and salt, undercut by something metallic. Calvin appeared from the annex, his sleeves rolled, hands scrubbed raw, nodding once before stepping aside to let them pass. Clara and Isabel stood in the far corner of the parlor, their heads bowed, their pale lids shut as always. But their posture was not that of children startled by strangers. It was the stillness of those waiting for a cue. Eleanor spoke little as she led them to the annex. The storm outside had muffled the world to a dull roar, and the travelers followed willingly, perhaps grateful for any space out of the wind. The annex door swung open to reveal a room transformed from its usual cold utility. A long table stood in the center, covered with a white cloth so tightly fitted that no crease interrupted its surface. Upon it were set bowls, small porcelain dishes filled with milk so pale it reflected the lamplight like glass. Others holding coarse salt piled into neat cones, and still others containing what at first glance might have been cuts of preserved meat. But each piece was shaped, too perfectly arranged with labels written in Eleanor's hand. Tongue stilled, hands folded, heart rested. The chairs were placed with mathematical precision, the largest at the head where Eleanor sat, the twins positioned one on each side of her, their hands resting in bowls of ice water. The guests were guided to their seats without invitation to choose. The woman selling fabrics glanced once at the door, then at Calvin, who stood beside it with the bolt in his hand. The boy's eyes darted to the brass funnel in the wall, its narrow throat disappearing into the shadows above. The two railway men looked to each other, their expressions tightening as if some unspoken thought passed between them. Eleanor spoke then, her voice carrying evenly down the length of the table. She talked of the storm, of the blessings of shelter, of the gift of shared stillness. She invited each guest to dip their fingers into the milk, to touch the salt, to taste the preserved flesh so that the noise of the road might be left behind. Her words were framed as courtesy, but the rhythm of them had the weight of ritual, each phrase measured, each instruction delivered with the same deliberate tone she used in the sound room. The twins did not speak. They kept their hands submerged, their breathing slow and steady, their faces expressionless. When one of the railway men hesitated to follow her instructions, Eleanor simply fixed her gaze on him until he obeyed, dipping his fingers into the milk and raising them to his lips. The boy at the end of the table trembled visibly when asked to taste the salted meat, but did as he was told. Only the fabric seller refused, pushing the bowl away. Eleanor smiled faintly, not in offense, but as though she had been waiting for such a choice. She made a small mark on a folded slip of paper beside her plate. The storm raged on, battering the annex walls, but inside the table remained untouched by any sense of haste. Eleanor's voice filled the space, weaving between the low moan of the wind and the occasional creak of the beams overhead. The bowls were passed, emptied, refilled. The preserved organs, neatly trimmed and glistening, were consumed in small, precise bites. No one spoke but Eleanor, and even she allowed long silences to stretch, as if measuring how well her guests could endure them. By morning, only 2 travelers emerged from the Patterson home. The railway men were seen in town later that day, pale and damp, speaking to no one. The woman and the boy were never seen again. No wagons left the property. No footprints were found in the mud beyond the yard. When asked, Calvin said the missing pair had left at dawn to catch the road east before the rains deepened. The constable visited, but the annex was clean, the table cleared, the bowls washed and dried. Only a faint ring of salt remained on the floor beneath where the boy had sat, and a pale, wet imprint of 2 small hands rested on the cloth where the twins had been. In the years that followed, the story of that night took on the name The Autumn Feast, and whispers passed through Millwater. It was told differently in every retelling, sometimes as a tale of strangers given shelter and vanishing into the storm, other times as a warning of a table set for more than food. But one detail remained in every version, that the twins sat silent and unblinking throughout, their hands in ice water, their faces calm, as though they were keeping time with something no one else could hear. By the spring of 1889, the whispers about Hollow Creek had thickened into something heavier. Not yet accusation, but a weight on the air when the Patterson's name was spoken. The constable, Thomas Hale, had carried his suspicions for years, each visit to the property adding a new stone to the pile. The disappearance of Joseph Murdoch, the winter when 3 children vanished, the traveling peddler who never left, the autumn storm when 2 guests emerged but 2 did not. All of it lay without proof, but in Hale's mind the pieces had already begun to fit. When a farmer reported seeing faint plumes of steam rising from behind the annex at dawn, in a season too warm for frost, Hale decided the time had come to step inside. He arrived without fanfare on a day when the sky hung low and gray, his boots sinking slightly in the damp lane. Calvin answered the knock, his frame filling the doorway. Eleanor appeared behind him, hands folded, her face calm as ever. Hale explained the purpose of his visit. There had been reports, and he needed to see the annex. Calvin hesitated, his gaze flicking to Eleanor. She stepped forward, the keys hanging from a small iron ring at her waist. With a deliberate slowness, she selected one, turning it in her fingers before passing it to Hale as though offering him a privilege. The door groaned on its hinges, and the air that spilled out was cool and dense, carrying with it a faint tang of salt and something older, a smell that clung to the tongue rather than the nose. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through the wool-lined walls. Hale's eyes adjusted to find a room stripped of anything that might be called ordinary. The floor was covered in a fine dusting of salt, swept into deliberate patterns radiating outward from the center. In the walls, deep grooves had been worn into the wool where rope or leather had rubbed against it again and again. And everywhere etched into the beams were tally marks, hundreds of them arranged in neat vertical columns. Each was paired with a date, the earliest more than a decade old, the most recent only days past. Hale's breath caught, but he forced his voice steady as he asked Eleanor what the marks meant. She tilted her head as if weighing how much to tell him, then said they were measures of progress. No further explanation offered. He moved deeper into the room, his boots sinking slightly into the salt. At the far wall, his fingers brushed against the brass funnel protruding from between the wool panels. It was warm to the touch, faintly vibrating, as though some distant movement traveled through it. When he asked its purpose, Eleanor replied without hesitation. It carried the voice of the house to the quiet ones below. In the center of the room sat the chair, heavy oak, worn smooth where wrists and ankles had been strapped. The padded headrest showed faint indentations in its surface, as if a skull had rested there many times. Above, a hinged clamp hung open, ready to descend. Hale stepped around it, his eyes scanning for stains or fibers, but the wood had been scrubbed to a dull polish. It was too clean, the kind of clean that follows a deliberate erasure. Calvin stood silent at the door, his hand resting lightly on the bolt, his eyes never leaving Hale. The constable felt the weight of the moment, He was close, closer than anyone had ever been. But the absence of a body, of a scream, of anything living or dead left him with nothing that could be written into an official report. The marks could be dismissed as eccentricity, the chair as an invention for discipline, the salt as some obscure preservation method. Without proof, the law would not hold. Hale turned to face Eleanor. For the first time in all his visits, she stepped toward him, her gaze level and unblinking. She asked, with a voice quiet enough that Calvin had to lean to hear it, whether he had come to join the quiet. The words were not a threat in tone, but something colder. An invitation to step across a line that once crossed could not be undone. He left without answering, stepping into the damp air with the weight of failure pressing into his chest. Behind him, the door shut. The bolt slid home and the key returned to Eleanor's ring. He walked back down the lane, his boots heavy in the mud, the smell of salt still clinging to him. The annex stood silent once more, its secret sealed behind wool and wood. In the months that followed, Hale carried the memory of that room like a splinter under the skin. He knew what he had seen was not innocent, but suspicion without evidence was a shadow too thin for the court. And so the Pattersons continued their lives unchanged, walking to church in their immaculate black, the twins between them, heads bowed, lids sealed, breathing in perfect unison. The town, sensing that the law could not touch them, let the matter drift back into whispers. But for Hale, the tally marks scratched into the beams haunted him most. He had counted 47 before he stopped, unable to decide whether they marked lives taken, sessions endured, or both. December of 1890 came with an early freeze, the kind that made the trees groan under their own weight and turned the creek into a slab of dull white glass. Hollow Creek lay buried under a brittle silence, the kind that felt permanent. On the night of the 12th, a neighboring farmhand named Samuel Rudd was crossing the back fields when he heard it. A sound that ripped the stillness apart. It was not a cry, not even human in the way a voice is human, but something stretched beyond the limits of breath. A jagged wail that carried through the frozen air like metal dragged over stone. It came from the direction of the Patterson home, shattering the illusion that place had ever been truly quiet. Rudd stopped where he stood, the hair on his arms rising even beneath his coat. The scream rose once more, then cut off so sharply it felt as if the air itself had been clamped shut. After a moment's stunned hesitation, he turned and ran for town. By morning, the story had spread, and a group of townsmen, with the constable among them, made their way to Hollow Creek. The frost clung to the house's windows in thick, uneven sheets, and no smoke curled from the chimney. The door was locked, and when it was forced open, a rush of stale, icy air spilled out, the inside colder than the winter outside. They found Calvin first, hanging from a ceiling beam in the hallway, the rope biting deep into the pale skin of his neck. His boots had been kicked off, lying neatly side by side on the floor below, as though he had taken care not to scuff the wood before stepping onto the chair that now lay tipped on its side. In the annex, Eleanor sat slumped in the heavy oak chair, her hands resting limp against the straps. Her head tilted unnaturally back against the padded rest. The hinged clamp was locked in place around her skull, her jaw slack, her eyes, unlike her daughter's, wide open but clouded, frozen in a grimace that looked almost like pain, almost like relief. Clara and Isabel were found in the far corner of the annex, seated on the floor with their backs against the wall. Their pale lids were parted for the first time anyone could remember. But what lay beneath was emptiness. Not blindness in the sense of ruined eyes, but sockets that were clean, smooth, and entirely hollow. The skin was unbroken, as if the flesh had grown closed over years, sealing whatever had once been there away forever. Yet their chests rose and fell with the faint, slow rhythm of breath. They did not respond to the men who entered, nor did they flinch when the constable knelt before them. They sat with their hands folded, heads tilted in mirrored angles, their expressions neither frightened nor aware, as though the noise of the world had ceased to exist for them. The sound room bore no sign of a struggle, only the same meticulous order as before. The walls lined with wool, the floor dusted with salt, the brass funnel fixed to the wall. But the tally marks carved into the beams now stood at 51, 4 more than Hale had counted during his last visit. On the table near Eleanor's body lay a single open journal. Its most recent entry dated the night before. The words were few, written in her steady hand. The quiet is complete. No one could agree on what had happened in those final hours. Some believed Calvin had finally broken under the weight of what he had helped to build, ending both his life and Eleanor's. Others whispered that something within the sound room had turned on its keeper, that the scream Rudd had heard was the last noise to ever break from the house before silence claimed it forever. The twins, carried from the annex in blankets, did not resist, but their heads turned slightly toward one another as they were taken away, as if listening to something no one else could hear. By nightfall, the house stood empty, its windows fogged with the breath of the day's intrusions. The bodies of Calvin and Eleanor were taken to the churchyard, their burial simple and without sermon. The townsfolk left quickly afterward, eager to be away from Hollow Creek before the early dark closed in. But some swore that as they passed the bend in the road, they saw the faint glow of lamplight behind the curtains once more, and the shadow of 2 small figures moving in perfect unison across the parlor floor. The annex remained locked for 3 days after the bodies were removed, the authorities unsure whether to treat it as a crime scene, a storage building, or something stranger. In the end, it was the constable, Thomas Hale, who insisted it be opened. He had walked away too many times before. Now, with Eleanor and Calvin gone, there was no one left to bar the door. On the morning of the 4th day, under a pale, brittle sky, the key was taken from Eleanor's apron pocket and turned in the lock for the last time. The air that spilled out was colder than the frost outside, heavy with the stench of salt and something that had seeped too deep into the wood to ever be scrubbed away. The wool lining on the walls was damp in places, shedding in clumps. The boards beneath blackened where moisture had eaten through. The floor was no longer the clean, geometric pattern of salt Hale remembered. It was broken by long, uneven depressions, as if the ground itself had shifted under the weight of something buried and unburied many times. The tally marks carved into the beams were counted again. The final number stood at 51. Beneath each date was a faint scratch, sometimes a single line, sometimes a cluster, as though Eleanor had been tracking not just the passing of lives but the variations in their quality or success. Near the far wall, the brass funnel remained fixed in place, but the wool surrounding it had been worn thin, revealing a small, hidden hatch behind. When it was pried open, the space beyond was not a cupboard but a narrow chute descending into the earth. The smell that rose from it silenced the room. A ladder was fetched, and the men descended into a cramped chamber dug into the clay. The walls were lined with slabs of wood driven deep to hold back collapse. Along one side lay shallow pits filled with a mixture of salt, wool, and bone. The bones were pale and brittle, some no larger than a finger joint, others whole enough to betray their origin. A jaw with small teeth still set in it, a child's femur, a rib with a hairline fracture along its curve. The salt had preserved them from decay, but it had not stripped away the truth. In the far corner, a half-buried crate was pulled free and opened. Inside were small items, each wrapped in linen and labeled in Eleanor's careful hand. Subject 19, hands folded. Subject 34, teeth removed. Subject 45, tongue stilled. The linens, when unwrapped, revealed what the labels promised. Each specimen had been preserved with the same obsessive precision, the cloth clean, the folds exact, as if they were relics meant for veneration rather than evidence. A second crate contained sketches. Some were anatomical, drawn with surprising skill. Lungs rendered in pale ink, the curve of an ear, the fine bones of the hand. Others were less precise, more like portraits, but the subjects were always the same. The twins at different ages, their faces turned slightly downward, their lids sealed, their posture unchanging. In one, they were infants swaddled in dark cloth, black stitches visible along the line of their lashes. In another, they stood in the yard, taller but no older in expression, each holding a bowl of salt. The journals were the final discovery. Dozens of them bound in plain cloth, each one filled from the first page to the last in Eleanor's steady script. They chronicled every experiment, every session, every removal. She described the preparation of subjects, the results of her methods, the progress of Clara and Isabel in becoming true vessels of the quiet. The language was clinical, never admitting cruelty, never acknowledging fear or resistance. She referred to the taking of lives as adjustments, and to the dissolution of bodies as final cleansings. There were no apologies, no doubts, only the conviction that she had been shaping something pure, something worth every cost. When the last journal was closed, the room seemed to grow smaller. The men carried the bones out in sacks, the crates in heavy silence. The pits were filled, the chute boarded over. Some argued the annex should be burned to the ground, but others feared the smoke would carry its poison into the town. In the end, the building was left standing, the door nailed shut, the key thrown into the creek. Clara and Isabel did not witness the unsealing. They had been taken to Baltimore 2 days before, placed under the care of an institution that agreed to accept them only after repeated pleas from the county. No one there could say what passed between the twins in the hours after their parents' deaths. They did not speak to the nurses, did not open their lids, did not react to light, touch, or sound. They sat side by side in the far corner of their room, their heads tilted toward each other as if in constant wordless exchange. The doctors recorded their case as one of catatonic mutual orientation, a term that explained nothing. The annex remained untouched for years, weathering slowly in the shadow of the house until the wood began to sag and the roof caved under snow. But even in ruin, it carried a pull. Children dared each other to step inside. Farmers cut through the yard only when necessity forced them. Those who entered spoke of the air being heavier than outside, the smell of salt still clinging to the corners and the faint, impossible sense that something was still listening. Hale lived long enough to see the property sold off in pieces, the house dismantled for lumber, the land turned to pasture. But the annex was never repurposed. When he passed the site in his later years, he would glance toward where it had stood, his jaw tightening. He never told anyone exactly what he had seen in that underground chamber, nor how certain he was that the number 51 did not account for every soul that had passed through Eleanor Patterson's hands. Some truths he knew could never be spoken without dragging their silence into the open. And silence in the wrong hands was far more dangerous than noise. By 1895, the Patterson home was nothing more than a skeleton of timber and peeling paint. The land had been sold, then sold again, but no family stayed longer than a season. The annex, though weathered and leaning, was left untouched, a dark reminder at the edge of the pasture. Children dared each other to run and touch its door, but few ever crossed the threshold. Those who did swore the air inside was colder than the wind outside, carrying the faint sting of salt even after years of rain. Millwater did not speak openly of the Pattersons anymore. The events had been folded into the town's private history, a story carried in low voices at the back of the tavern or between rows at the church. Officially, the matter was recorded in the county ledger as a tragedy. Calvin Patterson, suicide by hanging. Eleanor Patterson, cause of death undetermined. Multiple disappearances in the region unresolved. There was no mention of the bones in the annex, no count of the tally marks carved into the beams. The law preferred clean endings and the truth was too jagged to fit. Yet the shadow of what had happened remained. Parents warned their children not to stray from the main road, not to linger by the creek, not to follow anyone who offered them shelter. The quiet became a kind of shorthand among the older folk, not just for silence, but for a stillness that carried danger, a warning that something was watching even when no eyes could be seen. In Baltimore, Clara and Isabel lived out their days in the upper ward of the state asylum. No visitor ever came for them, and no staff could say with certainty whether they recognized the world around them. They sat together in the same corner each day, heads inclined toward each other, their breathing in the same slow rhythm they had kept since childhood. When the doctors attempted to separate them, even for examinations, their bodies grew tense and unresponsive, their heads turning toward one another as if listening to something no one else could hear. The lids remained closed, the skin over their sockets pale and unbroken. By the second year, the staff stopped trying to coax them into speaking or opening their eyes. They were fed, clothed, and left to their own silence. A small file was kept on their case, but the details were sparse. Catatonic mutual orientations, no change. Vital signs stable, no verbal output. Posture constant, no signs of discomfort. The years passed without alteration. The nurses said it was like tending to two statues that breathed. When Clara died first at the age of 43, Isabel's breath stopped less than an hour later. The doctors called it coincidence, but the older nurses shook their heads. In the end, they were buried in unmarked graves on the asylum grounds, their names entered in the records with no mention of what they had been. In Millwater, time softened the edges of the Patterson story, but never erased it. The farmhands who had once spoken of the smell from the barn grew old and passed on, but their children inherited the memory. The annex finally collapsed under a heavy snow in 1908, the timbers sinking into the earth like bones returning to their grave. When a crew came to clear the debris, they found the ground beneath still salted white crystals clinging to the roots of the grass. No one stayed long enough to dig deeper. Lawmakers in Maryland never named the Pattersons in any public act. But in 1897, a quiet amendment was passed restricting the use of certain sensory deprivation methods in hospitals and private care. The language was clinical, citing psychological deterioration and mortality concerns. But those who had been in the annex understood what had inspired it. The journals, sketches, and preserved remains recovered from the property were locked away in the county archive, accessible only by written request. Few ever asked, and those who did rarely spoke of what they saw. Over the years, the quiet became a piece of local folklore. Farmers told their children that if they wandered too far at night, they might hear the sound of a metronome in the dark, and if they followed it, they would never return. Travelers passing through were warned not to accept food or drink from strangers who spoke too softly. And every so often someone claimed they had seen two pale figures moving in the fog by the creek, their heads tilted toward each other, their steps perfectly in sync. For Constable Hale, who had retired by then, the legacy was not a ghost story, but a weight he could not put down. He knew that silence could be as dangerous as a blade, and that the town's decision to look away for so many years had been its own kind of complicity. When asked in his old age if he believed it could happen again, he only said that people would always prefer the comfort of not knowing to the cost of seeing clearly. The Patterson farm was gone, the annex reduced to soil, the twins long buried. But in Millwater there remained a quiet that was not peace, a silence that carried memory. And in that silence the legend endured, not as a story of madness or cruelty alone, but as a reminder that evil does not always roar when it comes. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hums like a metronome behind a closed door. And sometimes it leaves nothing but the sound of two breaths, measured and in perfect unison long after the rest of the world has gone still. Even now, more than a century after the last stone of the Patterson home sank into the soil, the story of Hollow Creek resists fading entirely. It lives in the quiet spaces, in the way a field seems unnaturally still after dusk, in the way the wind can drop suddenly, leaving the air heavy as though holding its breath. For those who know what stood there, the silence is not emptiness, it is memory. And memory, when it concerns evil, does not fade as quickly as people might wish. The Pattersons' crimes, when pieced together from the journals, the bones and the whispers, were not acts of sudden rage or desperate survival. They were meticulous, deliberate, carried out with the patience of someone who believed they were building something greater than themselves. That is the part that unsettles most when the story is told in full. Not the deaths themselves, as horrific as they were, but the absence of chaos in their making. Eleanor Patterson did not act from madness that came in bursts. She acted from conviction. She believed she was shaping purity, refining her daughters into vessels for the quiet, and in that belief she found a justification for every cruelty she performed. There is a temptation to separate such acts from the world we know, to imagine them as belonging only to some darker, more superstitious age. But the truth is more difficult. Evil like Eleanor's does not require a particular time or place. It needs only the cover of privacy, the willingness of neighbors to look away, and the absence of anyone willing to keep asking questions when the answers grow uncomfortable. In Millwater, those conditions were met for nearly 2 decades. And in that space, silence itself became a weapon. The twins, Clara and Isabel Zorn, were the ultimate expression of that weapon. They were not simply victims, they were the proof Eleanor sought to show that her methods had succeeded. 2 lives molded from infancy into a state beyond compliance, beyond resistance, existing in perfect stillness. Whether they understood the horrors around them or whether they were too deeply shaped to perceive them is a question no one can answer. Their lives and their deaths remain bound to the same mystery. What did they hear in that silence? And who, if anyone, were they listening to? The site where the annex once stood is overgrown now. A tangle of grass and wildflowers that hides the ground beneath. Children who play there often remark on how strange it feels to stand in the clearing, as though the air presses back against them, as though the ground is holding something it refuses to give up. Adults dismiss it as superstition, but many avoid the place all the same, and when the wind is right, some say they can hear the faint tick of a metronome, though there is nothing left that could make such a sound. The county archive still holds Eleanor's journals locked away in a cabinet whose key has not been turned in decades. The few historians who have read them speak of the clinical detachment with which she described her work, how she wrote of erasing a subject's breath or sight with the same tone she used to record the day's temperature. The drawings of the twins are perhaps the most disturbing, not because of what they show, but because of what they leave out. There are no eyes in any of the portraits, not even as empty shapes. The face is always smooth, blank, sealed. What makes the Patterson story endure is not simply the scale of the harm, but the philosophy beneath it. The idea that to perfect something you must strip it of all that makes it human. That noise, in any form, whether sound, sight, or thought, is a flaw to be corrected. In Eleanor's mind, she was not a killer but a keeper, preserving her children and her chosen few in a state unspoiled by the disorder of the world. It is a belief that in different clothing has appeared again and again throughout history. In institutions, in movements, in individuals who speak softly of order and improvement while building their own annexes in the dark. The lesson of Hollow Creek is not simply to remember what happened, but to recognize how easily it could happen again. Silence is not always peace. Discipline is not always virtue. And when someone insists on shaping others into their idea of perfection, the line between refinement and destruction can vanish without anyone noticing until it is far too late. So the question lingers heavier than any ghost story. Could it happen again? Could there be another house on some quiet bend of road, where the curtains are always drawn, where the children never meet your eyes, where the air feels just a little too still? The uncomfortable truth is yes, because the conditions have not changed. People still prefer comfort to confrontation. Communities still teach themselves to ignore what they cannot explain. And those who wish to work in secrecy still know how to wear the mask of normalcy, just as Eleanor Patterson did. The midwife in black wool, the mother walking her daughters to church, the neighbor who never raised her voice. In the end, the Patterson story is not a closed case but a mirror. It reflects the cost of looking away, the danger of mistaking silence for safety, and the enduring truth that evil does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it enters quietly, shuts the door, and begins its work in the dark. And when it is finished, it leaves behind not the sound of violence, but the absence of sound. A silence so deep it feels as though it could swallow you whole. What do you think? Could this happen again?